Hi, and welcome back to my sewing room. In the last video, we looked at some supplies for thread painting snow. If you haven't seen that video, I will link it up here and in the description box below. You might want to check that out before you watch this one. But if you've seen it already, then let's get started learning how to thread paint some snow. I actually started this project back in February, and it has taken me a lot longer than I anticipated to get this next video made, edited, and up for you to view. I'm happy to have this one ready for you now because we are due to move on to some springtime projects. It's getting warm outside, so let's finish up this snow. There's two ways I approach adding shadows and highlights to a thread painted project. So in this first part, I'm actually going to add the dark threads first, and then I'll come back with some of the lighter threads and blend it in. But these dark lines will help to determine where the wind has blown some snowdrifts in our wintry scene. So the first thing I did was divide up my snow into 3 parts. And in the part closest to the horizon where you see I've quilted, I started with the purple thread to determine those shadow lines of where some of the snowdrifts are. And then I went back in with 2 grays and finally a white to fill in that section. But then moving on, I quilted this middle section with that purple thread as well, but I also added in some of the blue threads to add a little shadow into the snow along with the grays, and then finally the white thread. And the very darkest of the blues and grays that you saw in the first video, I used to cast some shadow underneath the evergreen tree where the branches would be hanging over the snow. And in the foreground, I used mostly white to do the quilting, and I added in a little detail with some S-curves to create a little snowdrift kind of effect there in the very bottom of the quilt. And then you'll also see I added some Angelina fibers. That's what's giving that iridescent, very luminescent look to the snow. I used a variety of the white Angelina fibers directly below the tree, and then on either side of the tree I did add a little bit of blue Angelina fibers in with the white, just to add a little more interest and depth. Okay, with the bulk of our snow thread painted, let's start adding some embellishments. First, I'm going to use a fringe foot, and this will help to add a little bit of dimension to our snow. And I started with the horizon line, so that's what you see here. And what a fringe foot does is create these little loops. Now this I've used 2 strands of thread, so I get a thicker look to it. But I don't like the look of leaving it looped like this. Once I've stitched the whole line with the fringe foot, I will go back with my free motion foot and quilt over the loops and just kind of smash them down, so that way you get the look of the texture but not seeing those individual loops. So let's take a look here at the fringe foot in action. So you can see I've chosen to travel just to the right of the dark stitching line, and my machine is set up with the feed dogs up, and I'm using a zigzag stitch. Let's take a closer look at why. There's actually a metal bar running through the center of this foot. And as the zigzag stitches over that bar, it creates those loops. So you can't use this foot with a straight stitch. It always has to be in a zigzag. But you can vary the width of the zigzag as well as the stitch length to determine how many loops you are adding. Okay, so I've completed all the lines of the fringe foot quilting that I want to do. You can see the majority of them are still left in these loops. And where I chose to quilt each line is just in front of the dark color that I had quilted before. I also used a variety of threads for these quilting lines with the fringe foot. So in the very back, I used these 2 threads to create the horizon line, but on this side I used this gray along with the white for that horizon line. And then I used mostly this white for many of these lines through this midsection, but occasionally I used this gray for a couple lines through here, and then this gray on this side. When I got to these couple lines in the foreground, I used a metallic thread along with this white. And I also increased the width of the zigzag I used on the fringe foot. And for this final line in front of the tree, I used the metallic along with the white, but I stitched at the widest setting of the zigzag on my machine. And I also decreased the stitch length so it's very dense. So now what I'll do is go back to my machine, put on the free motion foot, and I will use the color thread that corresponds with each line of these fringe foot quilting to free motion over top and quilt it down, just like we had done up here. And then I've set my machine back up with the free motion foot. My feed dogs are down. And I've used the same thread in the top of my machine as I did to stitch out the loops with the fringe foot. And all I'm going to do is free motion over top of this line of loops, just kind of in a loopy little fashion so that the loops get smashed down in all different directions. The final embellishment I added is some bobbin work down here in the foreground. And to do that, I use this Madeira thicker thread. And the thickness of this is at the upper end of the thickness that I want to put through the tension discs on my machine. So I chose to wind it around a bobbin, like this. And then I put this in the bottom of my machine with white thread on top, and I quilt it upside down. So we can take a closer look. I did a few lines through here with the thread, and then I did a thicker buildup in this section here to add a little more dimension to the snowdrift I created. I also went back and added just a little bit more shadow right here under the tree. And after I quilt the tree, I might even go back and add a little bit more. We'll see how it ends up looking. And then the last thing I did was take this whole sandwich to my ironing board, and I flipped it upside down and gave it a good pressing from the back to smooth out any of the warps that were created. Okay, and with that bobbin work done, I think we're going to put this project on hold and move on to some springtime things. But I will pull this back out on a hot day when we need to cool down with a little bit of snow, and I'll show you how to thread paint the evergreen tree, because we want to add some details to the branches, but also include some snow on the tree. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I hope you learned something new and got inspired to go work in your sewing room. I'll see you in the next video.